Hey everyone, this is drewhowdentech, and I'm on a mission to combine Active Directory with Linux. Now I know what you're thinking, Drew, Active Directory is a Windows thing. You can't use it on Linux. Well, have you ever heard of Samba? In case you're unfamiliar, Samba is a re-implementation of Windows networking protocols for Linux and other Unix-like operating systems. It's primarily used to create and access Windows shares from Linux systems. I actually have an old video on this channel that utilized Samba to create a home file server on Ubuntu server. What most people don't know is that Samba also has an Active Directory component. And that's what I'm going to show you in this video. But first, I'm going to set up a Windows domain on a Windows server, and then show you the process of joining it from a Linux system. Then I'll go over provisioning a Linux server as a domain controller. By the way, I'm demonstrating this on Ubuntu, but the procedure is pretty similar for other Linux distributions. Just instead of the apt command, you would use another command to install the required packages. And the packages themselves might be called something slightly different. But with that said, let's set up a Windows domain on a Windows server first. Alright, so here I have a fresh installation of Windows Server 2025, and I've done nothing with it yet other than installing guest editions so you could see what's going on in full screen, disabling Windows Update so that it doesn't prompt me, we have updates to install in the middle of this video. And I've also changed the name of the server, which is a good practice. Just anytime you do a fresh install of Windows Server, rather than have your server name be just win-blah blah blah. And I'm going to create a new Active Directory forest. To do that, I'm going to click Manage, Add Roles and Features, and then install the Active Directory Domain Services role. Well, yep, let's add these features. Next, 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 and then install. Alright, now that Active Directory Domain Services is installed, next I'm going to promote this server to a domain controller because it doesn't happen automatically. And since we're creating a new domain, we're going to add a new forest. And then I'm going to set my root domain to drewhowdentech.com, then hit next, then set a directory services restore password, and then I am going to not create a DNS delegation just because I'm doing this in a home lab environment. If you just made up a domain name, then you won't have this option. Essentially, for the purposes of this video, although I'm using a real domain name that I own, I'm essentially just pretending it's a made-up one, so then I don't have to bother modifying my DNS records or any of that business just for a video. Like, I'm just gonna completely wipe all this after I'm finished. And then when you hit next, it's gonna give you a NetBIOS domain name based on your root domain name. You can change it here if you'd like, but for me, drewhowdentech is great. And this doesn't have the .com or .org or whatever. This is fine as is, so I'm gonna do that. And just to do a quick review of my selections here, and then it's just gonna do a prerequisites check. One thing it's warning me about here is that I'm using a dynamic IP address. For an actual production environment, you should use static IPs on your domain controllers or really any server providing network services to other users. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to use a dynamic IP. But anyway, I'll just click install and let it go. All right, and then once that process is finished, this is something that could take anywhere from 10 to 60 minutes, so be patient. then the computer will restart and finish installing Active Directory on your server. This can take anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes, maybe even longer in some cases, so be patient. And that's kind of the golden rule whenever you're working with a Windows system, is be patient. Honestly, I can't wait to get to the Linux part of this video. But anyways, I'll come back after this is done. Alright, once our server restarts, you'll immediately notice that now it's part of our newly created domain. Now we're going to log in as the administrator, and now we're logging in as the domain administrator. Alright, now that we're back in our server manager, I'm going to go to local server, which is my only server here. Give that a second to load up, and we can see that, yep, this is part of the domain. So now let's go over to a Windows PC and join it to our newly created domain, just to show you that this is working. So the first thing I gotta do is go into my DNS settings and change the DNS server 2.2 to our Windows server. To do that, I'm gonna go into Control Panel by opening up the Run dialog and then typing Control, then go to Network and Internet, Network and Sharing Center, and then go to our Wi-Fi connection, because this is on a Wi-Fi connection. Then go to Properties, Internet Protocol version 4. We're not going to worry about IPv6 in this video. And then use the following DNS server addresses. The IP address for that Windows server is 192.168.1.181. Then let's click OK. And the reason why this works is because when you install Active Directory domain services and promote your server to a domain controller, DNS services are automatically installed. Next, I'm going to go to Settings, System, About, and then rename this PC to open up this window, and then click this Change button, and then set it as Member of Domain. Now you will need to be on Windows Pro or higher to join to a domain. So if this option is grayed out, it's probably because you're on Windows Home. But anyway, now I'm going to type in my domain, drewhowdentech.com, and now it's going to ask me for the password of an account with permission to join the domain. In my case, it's just the default administrator account, because I just set this up quickly just for demonstration purposes. But this account really should have a different name. Now I'm going to hit enter. And assuming that you've changed your DNS server to your domain controller, or you've configured a DNS delegation for your real domain, and you've entered in your username and password correctly, and the account has permission to join to a domain, then you'll see this message, welcome to the domain. Now, if you get an error joining the domain, 9 times out of 10, it's a DNS issue. So make sure that your DNS is set properly. And I'm going to hit OK, and then it'll prompt you to restart your computer. Pardon me while I do that. All right, and as you can see, I've logged in as the domain administrator on this PC, and that's it as far as the Windows side of things go. Now let's make it a little bit harder by joining our domain on a Linux system. To do this, we're going to have to use the terminal. And first of all, we got to install a couple packages by doing sudo apt install realm d samba, then hit enter, punch in your password, and then hit yes to install. And the next thing we got to do is set the host name of our PC to a fully qualified domain name, which consists of our hostname.domain.top-level domain. So I'm going to do sudo hostnamectl, hostname, ubuntu-pc.drewhowdentech.com. That's the fully qualified domain name for this system. And we can verify that by running the hostname command. And yep, ubuntu-pc.drewhowdentech.com. Now, before we can actually join our domain, what we've got to do first is go into our network settings and then change our DNS. First of all, we got to disable automatic DNS. But then we got to set our DNS server to the IP address of our domain controller. Again, for me, that's 192.168.1.181. Then hit apply. Then disable the network, and then re-enable it. Now if we go back into our network settings, now our DNS is set to our domain controller. Now we can join our domain by doing sudo realm join -- membership -software equals samba -- client -software equals winbind, and then our domain, which in my case is drewhowdentech.com. And if your administrator user is called something other than administrator, which is actually a good practice, then add -U and then your username. But now hit enter and then type in your administrator's password. And now we're on the domain. Now there's one more gotcha you got to be aware of before we can log in as a domain account. This system is not set to create a home directory for new users that log into the system, which means that obviously the user isn't going to have anywhere to put their files, and you will notice all kinds of weird things immediately after logging in as a domain user. To set the system to automatically create a home directory for new users that log into the system, just do sudo pam-auth-update -- mkhomedir, then hit enter, and now we can reboot the system. All right, and then once it restarts, what you're gonna have to do if you've never logged in with a domain account on this system before is click not listed and then type username. I'm gonna log in as the domain administrator. So I'm gonna type administrator at your domain and then punch in your password. And then we'll get the Ubuntu initial setup screen. We can go through that real quick. And as you can see, we are in our domain administrator's home directory. And if we look at our user account settings, we could see that our account's name is drewhowdentech/administrator. And it even shows up in the terminal here. By the way, to leave a domain, just log in as a local user, like not a domain user, and run sudo realm leave in the terminal, and then restart the system. All right, so now I'm going to show you how to set up a Windows domain on a Linux server and provision it as a domain controller. I'm demonstrating this on Ubuntu server. First step is to install a few packages by doing sudo apt install samba-ad-dc krb5-user bind 9-dns-utils. Then hit enter, punch in your password, then hit yes to install. Leave the default Kerberos realm blank and hit enter. All right, now once that's installed, next we got to disable a few services that conflict with Samba Active Directory domain services by doing sudo systemctl disable --now smbd nmbd winbind, and then sudo systemctl mask smbd nmbd winbind. And now we got to enable Samba Active Directory domain services by doing sudo systemctl unmask samba-ad-dc, and then sudo systemctl enable samba-ad-dc. Now, before we can set up our domain and provision our server as a domain controller, there's one last thing you got to do, which is to move the default Samba configuration file out of the way so it doesn't conflict with what we're about to do. To do that, just do sudo mv/etc/samba/smb.conf /etc/samba/smb.conf.orig. Now we're ready to set up our domain. To do that, do sudo samba-tool domain provision --domain, your domain name without the TLD. In my example, drewhowdentech without the .com --realm equals your domain .tld. In my example, drewhowdentech.com --server -role equals dc --use -rfc 2307 -dns-backend equals samba_internal, all in caps. And then once you're done, your command should look something like this. Just hit enter once you're done, and then it'll create your domain and provision your server as a domain controller. All right, so now that command's done, and as you can see, if you look where it says admin password, you can see that it generated an admin password for us. You might want to set this to something else. To do that, just do sudo samba-tool user set password administrator, then type in the password that you want and confirm it. And now we've changed our administrator password. By the way, you can use this exact same command to change or reset a password for any user on your domain. Just replace administrator with the username of the account whose password you want to change. So now there's a few things we got to do before our domain controller is fully functional. The first is to configure our server as its own DNS server, which is required for Active Directory domain services to function properly. Because without that, our workstations won't even find our domain controller. To do that, we're going to edit our new Samba configuration file that was generated by the samba-tool command by doing sudo nano /etc/samba/smb.conf, and then come down to DNS forwarder. It'll be the first line under global. This is the server that'll forward DNS requests for other domains besides our domain too, so that our workstations can look up domain out on the internet. By default, this is just pointing back to our server, which is not good. So we got to change this to another DNS server. I prefer to use Cloudflare's, which is 1.1.1.1. That's nice and easy to remember. Once you've set that, just hit Control-X, Y, then hit Enter to save and close the file. Next, do sudo unlink /etc/resolve.conf, and then sudo nano /etc/resolve.conf, and then type name server 127.0.0.1 to tell our server to use its own DNS services to resolve queries, since DNS forwarding is handled by Samba. Then hit enter, then type search your domain. Then once you're done, hit Control-X, Y, then enter to save and close the file. Now do sudo systemctl disable --now systemd-resolve d to disable Linux's built-in DNS services, because that's being provided by Samba. And then sudo cp-var/lib/samba/krb5.conf space /etc/krb5.conf. And finally, we're ready to start Samba's domain controller services by doing sudo systemctl start samba-ad-dc. And now our domain controller is up and running. To test this, we can do ns lookup our domain, and we could see that our domain points back to our domain controller. That's the IP address of this server, which is the IP address that I'll set as the DNS server on workstations that I want to join to this domain. Let's go do that right now. It's basically the same procedure to join our domain as was the case with the Windows server. Just set your DNS server to the IP address of your domain controller. In my case, it's 192.168.1.23. On Linux, you have to disconnect from your network and then reconnect for that change to take effect. And as we can see, yep, now our DNS has changed. And then we can use the exact same command as before, sudo realm join --membership -software equals samba -client -software equals winbind and then our domain. Punch in our password and then punch in the administrator password for our domain, and we're in. And you need to run the other three commands that I mentioned earlier in this video if you haven't already done so on this system. And now we can log in as our domain administrator. Again, if it's not listed, you have to go into not listed and then type username @domain. But now we're logging in as our domain administrator with the password that we set for it on our Ubuntu server. And there you go. So now, coming back to my Windows PC, I'm going to first of all change my DNS server to that of my Ubuntu domain controller. In my case, 192.168.1.23. Okay. Then close the network properties windows. Then I'll go back into my settings, system, about, rename this PC. I've already removed this from my Windows domain. But anyway, I'm going to click change again, and like basically it's the same procedure to join a Windows domain. I'm going to set this as member of domain, drewhowdentech.com, and then I'm going to log in as the administrator with my password. And now I'm part of the domain. By the way, my Windows server is not up right now, and since I've changed the DNS server to the IP address of my Ubuntu server, that's how you know we're on the drewhowdentech.com domain on my Ubuntu server. Now if we come back to our Ubuntu server and do a sudo samba-tool computer list, it'll show us the computers on our domain, including our server and our Ubuntu PC. And as we could see, our Windows PC is also listed. So that's part of the domain, like our Ubuntu server's domain. So now I'm just going to show you a couple best practices for new domains. The first thing you'll want to do is create a new account with administrator privileges and then disable the built-in administrator account, because the administrator account is the most commonly targeted account on Windows domains because it's the most privileged account. The same goes for the root account on Linux systems, which is why Ubuntu disables the root account by default. So I'm going to create a new user account with sudo samba-tool user add the username of your choosing, and then type in the password for your new user, then confirm it. Okay, user added successfully. So now what we've got to do to give this user administrative privileges is give it the same group memberships as our administrator account. To do that, we've first got to know what groups our administrator account is a member of. To do that, do sudo samba-tool user get groups administrator. It is part of domain users, which all new users are part of by default, along with domain admins, schema admins, enterprise admins, group policy creator owners, and the administrators group. To add a user to a group, do sudo samba-tool group add members, the name of the group in single quotes. I'm going to add myself to the domain admins group first, and then your username. Yep, added members to group domain admins. And then repeat this for all the groups that administrator is a part of. Okay, now that we've done that, we can do sudo samba-tool user get groups, our username, to verify that now we are a member of all these groups. Yes, we are. So now the next step is to disable the built-in administrator account with sudo samba-tool user disable administrator. Now the second best practice is to change the default password policies. To get the current password policies, do sudo samba-tool domain password settings show. And then this will show our password policies. Now, a few of these things we want to change, like password complexity is graded on. We are not storing plain text passwords by default, which is great. Now, password history length dictates how many old passwords our server remembers. And what that does is that doesn't allow a user to reuse an old password. Now, minimum password length by default is at 7. That really should be at least 12 in this day and age. So let's go change some of those password policies. To do that, do sudo samba-tool domain password settings set, and then put in your new password policies. First of all, we're going to change the minimum password length with -- min-pwd-length equals, and we're going to set it to 12 characters. Another thing we're going to change is the minimum password age, which is the minimum amount of time between password changes. In my opinion, this should be 0, because you want to be able to change a compromised password at any time. So --min-pwd-age equals 0. Now we're going to disable the maximum password age, which by default is 42 days. I've actually made a whole video on why password expiration actually does more harm than good for your security. But simply put, first of all, if you have weak passwords, changing them regularly does nothing to improve your security. And it actually makes people more likely to use less secure passwords. So I would advise disabling this unless you're under some regulation that requires you to expire passwords after a certain amount of time. So we can do that with --max-pwd-age equals 0, and that sets passwords to never expire. And you'll probably also want to enable the policy that locks out accounts after a certain amount of failed password attempts to prevent brute force attacks. We can do that with --account-lockout-threshold equals, and I like to set that to 10 failed password attempts. Depending on what industry you're in, you might want to set this to be less, like, for example, 3 failed password attempts. And while we're at it, we might as well set our account lockout duration, which by default is 30 minutes. You might want to increase that to 60 minutes, which you can do with --account-lockout-duration equals 60. And then verify that you typed everything correctly and that you've got your password policies typed exactly as you want them. Then hit enter, and yep, our changes applied successfully. We can do the sudo samba-tool domain password settings show again, and now it shows our new password policies. Okay, so now I've just went ahead and locked out my own account, as you could see by running the sudo samba-tool user show drew command. If you look towards the bottom of the output, so now to unlock an account, do sudo samba-tool user unlock, and then the username, and then we'll do a sudo samba-tool user show drew. And as we could see, our bad password count has been reset, and now our account is unlocked. Now, there's a lot more that you can do with the samba-tool command. I've just scratched the surface. So be sure to look at the man page for the samba-tool command by doing man samba-tool, and be sure to read through all the commands. Like, there's a lot in here. And also have a look at the help commands for individual commands. For example, samba-tool user --help. And then it'll show you all the available commands for the user subcommand. And that's it for this video. Be sure to give it a like if you liked it, dislike if you disliked it, comment, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and see you next time.